The orange falls into Maren's hands before she even sees the tree. One moment she is pushing through a curtain of hanging vines, half blinded by the canyon's green shadow, and the next a ripe fruit drops straight from a branch overhead and lands warm and heavy in her palms. The skin is smooth and bright and impossibly alive in a place where nothing alive should be, and for a long second she stands there holding it. Not breathing, not thinking, just feeling the weight of something she does not yet understand. But that moment is 3 weeks away. 3 weeks before the orange, before the canyon, before everything changes. A lawyer in Cedar City spreads his hands apologetically across his desk and tells the two young women sitting before him that their father's estate amounts to one thing only: a strip of canyon property outside Sandstone Crossing, uncultivated, unimproved, unwanted. It's rock and dust, he says, not unkindly. You may find a structure out there. You may not. I'll be honest with you, the county assessor didn't think it was worth the trip to evaluate. Maren Kestrel sits very still in the wooden chair across from him. She is 26 years old, and she has the kind of face that gives away nothing unless she decides to let it. Her hands rest flat on her knees. Her coat is clean, but mended at both elbows, and her boots have been resoled twice, and everything about her speaks of a woman who has learned to make things last because she has never had the luxury of replacing them. Beside her, Lenora looks at the deed the way a child looks at a letter written in a language she cannot read. She is 21, 5 years younger, and she has never been as good as her sister at hiding what she feels. Her eyes are already glassing over, and Maren can see the effort it costs her not to let the tears fall in front of a stranger. Maren picks up the deed. She reads it slowly, carefully, the way she reads everything. Then she folds it and puts it in her coat pocket and says, "Thank you, Mr. Merritt. We'll go have a look." The lawyer nods. He seems relieved that there will be no scene. He produces one more item from the envelope, a brief handwritten note on a single piece of paper, and slides it across the desk. "This was with the deed in your father's hand." Maren unfolds it. The handwriting is level and precise, each letter formed with the same deliberate care she has known her entire life. She has measured her father's love by that handwriting for as long as she can remember, by the steady evenness of it, rather than by what the words actually say, because what the words actually say has never been much. The note reads, "This is what I have for you. Go see it before you decide anything." That is all. No explanation, no apology, no tenderness dressed up in language. Just the instruction, offered with the same quiet faith Gideon Kestrel gave to everything else in his life. Maren puts the note in her pocket with the deed. "Come on, Lenora," she says. Outside, the March wind is sharp and dry, and the street smells of horse and coal dust. Lenora makes it all the way to the boarding house before she cries, which is longer than Maren expected. Their father had been a land surveyor for 20 years. He moved across the Utah and Arizona territories with his instruments and his mule, a quiet, lean-weathered man who found the edges of things and drew the lines that told other men what belonged to whom. He slept in his own camps more often than in any bed. He ate his own cooking more often than anyone else's. And once a month, without fail, he wrote his daughters a letter, always exactly 2 pages front and back, in that steady, careful hand. The letters never said much. Weather and distances and the names of rivers he had crossed. Occasionally, a brief observation about the land itself, the color of a particular mesa at sunset, or the way a certain kind of soil held water differently than another. Never anything about his feelings. Never anything about whether he missed them or thought about them or wondered what kind of women they were becoming. Maren had stopped expecting that years ago. Lenora had not. Gideon Kestrel died in early March quietly from a lung complaint that gave him 3 weeks of warning and no more. He had ridden himself to the doctor in Cedar City, received the diagnosis, settled his affairs with the lawyer, and then sent word to his daughters. By the time Maren arrived from Provo, where she had been working as a seamstress, and Lenora from Salt Lake City, where she'd been living with their aunt, and learning bookkeeping, Gideon was already too weak to sit up. They sat beside him for 2 days. He held their hands and said very little. Once he looked at Maren for a long time, with an expression she could not read, and seemed about to speak, but then he closed his eyes and the moment passed. He died the following morning while both of them were in the room, and the sound Lenora made was something Maren carries with her, still not loud, just broken, the sound of something that was already cracked, finally giving way. The grief was not dramatic. It settled in slowly, the way dust settles after a wagon passes on a dry road. You don't notice how much of it there is until you try to breathe. Maren arranged the wagon for the journey south. She was the practical one. She had always been the practical one, and grief did not change that. It only gave her more to organize around. She negotiated the hire of a patient older draft horse named Burl from the livery in Cedar City. She packed their tools, their seed tins, their blankets, and dried provisions. She calculated the 3-day drive south to Sandstone Crossing with the same composure she brought to everything. She was not going to cry over a worthless strip of canyon land. She was going to go look at it the way their father asked, and then she was going to decide what came next. Lenora cried twice on the first day of travel. She sang old hymns on the second morning, her voice thin and sweet against the enormous silence of the desert. By the third afternoon, she had gone quiet in the particular way that meant she was preparing herself for disappointment. Maren recognized that silence. She had heard it before when their mother died 7 years ago, and again when their father stopped coming home for Christmas, and again when the letters kept arriving with nothing personal in them, month after month after month. On the second night, they camped beside a dry wash where the rock shelf created a natural windbreak. Maren built a small fire and heated beans and dried meat while Lenora sat on the wagon tailgate, with her knees drawn up and her chin resting on them, looking at the stars. "Do you think he was happy?" Lenora asked. Maren stirred the pot. She considered the question the way she considered all of Lenora's questions seriously, even when they did not have answers. "I think he was himself. I don't know if that's the same thing. Mama used to say he loved the land more than he loved people. She didn't say it meanly. She said it the way you say someone has brown eyes. Just a fact." Maren remembered that. She remembered their mother standing at the kitchen window watching the road on the evenings Gideon was expected home, and the way her face would settle into something careful and patient when the road stayed empty, and the way she would turn back to the stove and say nothing and cook dinner for 3 instead of 4. Their mother had not been bitter. She had simply been accurate. "He loved us," Maren said. "He just didn't know how to make us feel it." Lenora was quiet for a long time after that. When Maren looked over, her sister was asleep against the wagon wheel with her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders and her face peaceful in the firelight. The country around them had grown strange and beautiful. Flat red tables of stone rising from the desert floor. Dry arroyos cutting through pale sand like old scars. The sky so wide and so blue it looked painted on. Maren watched the land change and thought about her father crossing this same ground year after year with his instruments and his mule alone, always alone, mapping the shape of a world that belonged to other people. Sandstone Crossing was a small, sun-bleached settlement with a general store, a livery stable, a church with a crooked bell tower, and about 40 residents who regarded the 2 young women and their loaded wagon with the particular mild curiosity of people who do not get many visitors and are not entirely sure they want them. The man at the livery stable was broad-shouldered and deeply weathered, the kind of man the desert builds over decades. His name was Josiah Ober, and when Maren told him who they were, Something shifted in his face that she could not quite read. Gideon Kestrel's girls, he said. Not a question. He said the name the way you say the name of someone you respected but never fully understood. You've come for the canyon land. We have, Maren said. Josiah looked off toward the red mesa to the south and was quiet for a moment. That strip's been in your father's name near 8 years. Folks here figured he'd sell it eventually. Nobody could work out what he was doing out there riding in alone the way he did. He paused, couldn't get him to say much about it. He said it without malice, but the words landed all the same. Their father had been keeping something. Maren felt the shape of that fact settle in her chest and stay there. Then Josiah glanced toward the general store where Lenora had gone to buy a few supplies and lowered his voice. The shift was subtle, but Maren caught it immediately. He was making sure they were alone. Miss Kestrel, I need you to know something. The Braddock brothers, Theron and Leland, they run the biggest cattle operation in this valley. They don't just want your land. Theron Braddock took my land 6 years ago. A small valley north of here, good water, good for running stock. He used Judge Nolan at the county court to rule that my water rights had insufficient legal standing. Josiah's jaw tightened. I lost the land in 3 weeks. Maren studied his face. My father knew about this. Gideon was the only man who stood up for me at that hearing. He brought survey maps proving the creek ran through my property. But Nolan threw out the evidence. Josiah looked at her directly. Your father never forgot that. He told me one thing after the hearing. He said, I won't let this happen again. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Maren stood very still. The pieces were beginning to shift in her mind, rearranging themselves into a picture she could not yet see clearly, but could feel forming at the edges. Thank you, Josiah, she said. That evening, they stayed at the one boarding house in Sandstone Crossing, a tidy place with starched curtains and swept floors, run by a widow named Mrs. Dunmore. She fed them bean soup and cornbread and asked questions with the practiced gentleness of someone who has learned to gather information without seeming to press. Your father's land, she said, refilling their cups with weak coffee. The Braddock boys tried to buy it from him 4 years back. Offered good money from what I heard. Gideon turned them down flat, didn't give a reason. Lenora looked at Maren over her cup. Why would anyone want it? Josiah at the livery called it worthless. Oh, the canyon itself is nothing to look at from the outside, Mrs. Dunmore said pleasantly. Narrow entrance, sheer walls, not enough flat ground to run cattle, not enough open sky to farm in any serious way. The Braddock boys want land that can hold a herd. Your father's strip couldn't do that. So to them, yes, worthless. She cleared the bowls and left them to the small parlor. Maren was turning Mrs. Dunmore's words over in her mind, specifically the phrase, from the outside, when the boarding house door opened and a man walked in. He was perhaps 35, hard-built with sun-darkened skin and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the strongest person in any room he entered. He wore good boots and a good hat, and he looked at the two sisters the way a man looks at something he is assessing the value of. Evening, he said. Leland Braddock, heard Gideon Kestrel's daughters came into town. Wanted to introduce myself. He did not sit down. He stood near the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving between them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular directness of a man who does not see any reason to dress up what he means. 2 young women alone out here, and I mean that with respect. But let me give you some honest advice. That canyon land has nothing for you. Nothing for city girls, and I don't mean that unkindly. Sell it to us, take the money, go back to your lives. You'll be better off. Maren met his eyes evenly. We haven't seen the land yet. Leland shrugged one shoulder. Go look then. You'll call on us after." He put his hat on, nodded once to each of them, and walked out. The door closed behind him. The room felt larger without him in it, and also somehow smaller. Lenora's hands were trembling slightly around her coffee cup. Maren reached across and steadied them with her own. "It's all right." That wasn't a suggestion, Maren. That was a warning. I know what it was. They sat in the lamplight after that, and Lenora said what both of them were thinking. What if it truly is nothing? What if we've driven 3 days and we find a broken down shack in a pile of rock and that's all there is? Maren turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Then that's what we find. Papa had nothing to leave us. Lenora's voice was careful and even, which meant she was working very hard not to let it break. That's the truth of it. He spent his whole life walking other people's land and drawing their lines, and at the end of it, there's one strip of canyon that nobody wants. She looked at the dark window. I don't want to feel angry at him. I don't want to. Then don't. I don't know how not to. Maren reached across and took her sister's hand. She held it for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing to say yet that would be true enough to matter. That night, after Lenora fell asleep in the narrow boarding house bed, Maren lay awake in the dark and remembered something she had not thought about in years. She was 16. Her father had taken her on a survey job, for the first and only time a 3-day trip to map a water dispute near the Nevada border. She remembered the heat and the dust and the particular way he moved across the land, slow and deliberate, reading the ground the way other men read books. On the second day, he had stopped near a dry wash and pointed to a line of slightly greener scrub running along the base of a low ridge. You see that, Maren? The land always tells you what it's hiding. The plants know where the water is before anyone else does. You just have to be patient enough to read what it's saying. He had smiled then, actually smiled. She had forgotten that until this moment, lying in the dark in a boarding house in a town she had never heard of 3 weeks ago, and now it came back so sharp and clear it hurt. She pressed her face into the pillow and breathed until the ache passed. In the morning they would go and look. Whatever was there, they would look at it. That had to be enough for now. The canyon entrance was 3 miles south of town, where the red rock country folded in on itself in a way that looked from the road like a solid wall with no opening at all. But there was an opening, narrow, barely wide enough for the wagon if Maren guided Burl carefully between the walls, and Lenora walked ahead, checking the clearance on each side. The walls rose 60 feet or more, smooth and deep red, still cool in the morning shadow. The sound of the wagon wheels on stone echoed upward and came back changed, multiplied as though the canyon itself were listening. Lenora stopped just inside the entrance and looked up. Oh, she said softly. It was not nothing. Already, just from the scale of it, just from the way the light fell in amber shafts from high above, and the air tasted different here, cooler, denser, carrying something green that had no business being in desert country. It was not nothing. Come on, then, Maren said and clicked her tongue to keep Burl walking. The first thing Maren noticed was the walls. She had expected dry stone, red and cracked, baking in its own heat the way desert rock always did. Instead, the walls of the canyon were dark with moisture in long vertical streaks. The stone was permanently wet along those lines, slick and almost black against the surrounding red, the way a cliff face looks after heavy rain, except that it had not rained in this country for weeks. She pulled Burl to a stop. Lenora, I see it. Lenora had both hands pressed flat against the canyon wall, and when she lifted them away, her palms were damp. She looked at Maren with an expression caught exactly between confusion and the first raw edge of hope. They left the wagon at a wide spot where the canyon floor broadened enough to let Burl stand comfortably, and they walked. The canyon curved. That was what the entrance had hidden. Not a short slot of rock opening onto emptiness, but a long, winding passage that turned gently south and then east. And with each turn, the walls grew higher and the air grew cooler, and the smell of green things grew stronger until it was unmistakable. Maren stopped and put her hand flat against the rock. It was cool to the touch, not the stored heat of sun-baked stone that she had felt on every rock face between Cedar City and here, but something tempered, something kept mild by moisture and shade. She drew her hand away and saw the faint film of water on her fingertips, and she understood then, before she saw anything else, that this place was different from any piece of ground she had ever stood on. Lenora had moved ahead. She was walking with her head tilted slightly upward, tracking something in the air. "Maren," she said, and her voice had the hushed, uncertain quality of someone who is not sure she can trust her own senses. "Do you smell that?" Maren smelled it. Green, wet earth, something flowering, and underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, the clean, sharp scent of citrus. In the desert, in late March, in a stone canyon 3 miles from a town where nothing grew that wasn't watered by hand. She did not answer. She walked faster. Then Lenora stopped. From somewhere ahead, perhaps 50 yards around the next curve, came a sound. Water. Not the imagined sound that a thirsty person in desert country sometimes conjures from silence and longing, but real water. Steady and silver and impossible. A thin stream falling from height onto stone and then running somewhere below. They looked at each other. They walked faster. The canyon opened. It did not open wide. It was still a sheltered cleft in the rock, perhaps 80 feet across at its widest, surrounded on all sides by soaring red walls that curved upward and then leaned slightly inward overhead, so that the sky was a long, bright stripe of blue, and the afternoon light entered at a slant and caught the far wall in a warm amber glow. But within that space, within those ancient walls, there was a world that had no right to exist. Water ran down the east wall in 3 separate streams, thin as ribbons, finding channels in the stone that had been carved over centuries and following them in silver threads to the canyon floor, where they collected in a shallow natural basin and then spread outward through a series of small channels cut into the rock. Cut by hands. Maren saw it immediately. Not natural erosion, deliberate, careful stonework, laid with intention, directing the water between raised garden beds and trees. Orange trees, a dozen of them perhaps more, heavy with ripe fruit in the afternoon light. Their dark, glossy leaves moved gently in the air that flowed down from the waterfall. Beside them, fig trees spread their broad leaves in deep shade. Along the base of the north wall, sheltered from direct sun, rows of kitchen herbs grew in neat beds. Thyme and sage, and something Maren didn't know by sight but recognized by smell, sharp and bright and clean. Flowers had seeded themselves into the cracks along the south wall, small and persistent purple and pale yellow. Vines spilled down from ledges 20 feet overhead, green, in a way that hurt to look at after 3 days of red desert. And at the far end, pressed against the west wall in the deepest shade, sat the cabin. Stone, low and solid, built from the same red rock as the canyon itself, so that it seemed almost grown from the place rather than built in it. A narrow door, 2 small windows, a roof of flat stone slabs laid with careful overlapping. Along the roof line, a thin line of flowering moss had taken hold in the mortar. Maren stood at the edge of it all and did not move for a very long time. Behind her, Lenora made a sound she had never heard her sister make before. Not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but something that lived precisely between the two, a sound the body makes when it encounters something it was not prepared for and does not know how to hold. They did not speak for several minutes. There was too much, and words would have broken something neither of them was ready to break. Instead, they walked slowly through the oasis because that was the only word for it, and they touched things. Lenora pressed her hand under one of the silver streamlets on the east wall and held it there while water ran over her knuckles and dripped from her fingers. Maren crouched beside one of the stone irrigation channels and traced its edge with one finger, feeling the smoothness, the clean, precise line of the cut. Years of work in every inch of it. Lenora pulled an orange from the nearest tree and held it in both hands and pressed it to her face and breathed in. She had not eaten a fresh orange since before their mother died 7 years ago. She stood under the tree with her eyes closed and the fruit against her face and did not move, and Maren let her be, because some moments do not need a witness so much as they need to be left alone. Then they went to the cabin. The narrow wooden door swung open without protest, recently oiled, and they stepped inside. One room small but proportioned with quiet care. A stone hearth along one wall. A narrow sleeping shelf built into the stone on either side. A rough-hewn table in the center, solid and level. Maren moved through the room slowly, the way she would move through a stranger's home, if that stranger had turned out to be someone she had misjudged for years. She ran her fingers along the mortar between the hearthstones and felt how tightly they were fitted. She crouched beside the sleeping shelf on the left side and saw that it had been sanded smooth, not roughly, but with deliberate care, as though someone had gone back over the surface more than once, until it would not catch the fabric of a blanket or scratch skin during sleep. On the shelf above 6 books stood in a neat row, their spines facing outward, and she recognized several of them. A handbook on soil cultivation, a guide to arid climate horticulture, a slim volume on stone masonry techniques, each one annotated in Gideon's even handwriting, with notes in the margins and pages marked with small folded corners. Against the west wall, a set of wooden pegs had been driven into the mortar at 2 different heights. One set at the height a tall man would hang his coat, the second set lower at the height of a shorter person. Maren stared at those pegs for a long time. 2 heights. He had built them for visitors, for daughters. Lenora had found something too. A small wooden box on the floor beside the hearth, its lid fitted with a leather hinge. Inside, wrapped in clean cloth, were 2 tin cups and 2 tin plates and 2 sets of utensils arranged with the same quiet precision that marked everything their father had touched. 2 of everything. He had never lived here with anyone else. He had always come alone, but he had set the table for 2. Maren closed the box and put it back. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and stood there until she could trust her voice. Then she straightened up and saw what she had missed before. On the table, weighted down by a smooth river stone, a folded piece of paper. Lenora reached it first. She unfolded it and read it, and then she looked at Maren with something on her face that made Maren cross the room in 3 steps. It was a letter, their father's handwriting, 3 pages long, the longest thing Gideon Kestrel had ever written to his daughters. It began, "My girls, by the time you read this, you will have already seen what I made, which means you already know more than I could have told you." 8 years earlier, surveying a water rights dispute 2 miles north of this canyon, Gideon had followed a subsurface moisture line by instinct and found the entrance. The water was fed by a natural spring high in the mesa above, reliable and year-round, extraordinary in this dry country. He had bought the land quietly for almost nothing because the canyon's shape hid every sign of the water from the outside. Then he had worked it alone, season by season, clearing, channeling, planting, building. "I wanted a place that would hold you," he had written. "I wanted to leave you something that couldn't be taken away by drought or price or another man's opinion." Lenora sat on the sleeping shelf and held the letter in both hands and wept openly. Maren stood beside her and read over her shoulder and did not weep. Not then, because she was too busy holding the pieces of herself together to let any of them fall. That evening, after Lenora had cried herself to sleep on the narrow stone shelf, Maren sat alone at the table. The amber light faded from the west wall, the canyon filled with its deep blue evening shadow. The orange trees became dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky above, and the sound of the three streams was the only voice in the room, steady and patient, and entirely without hurry. She sat with her hands flat on the table and stared at nothing, and breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest eased enough to allow thought. She had been wrong. For years she had been wrong. She had spent a decade believing that her father's silence meant emptiness, that his absence meant indifference, that the two-page letters with their careful handwriting and their descriptions of weather and distances were all there was of him. She had built a quiet, persistent resentment around that belief and carried it the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always aware of its weight, always reaching for it to confirm it was still there. And the whole time he had been here, in this canyon, alone, cutting stone channels with his own hands, planting orange trees for the daughter who loved oranges, building sleeping shelves for two because he always imagined them here, writing the longest letter of his life and leaving it under a river stone on a table he had built, knowing they would find it only after he was gone, knowing he would not be there to see their faces. Maren pressed both hands over her face and breathed until she could see clearly. In the morning, she woke before dawn and stood in the cabin doorway looking at the oasis in the first gray light. The decision had already been made somewhere in the night, not with her mind, but with something deeper. They would stay. She turned back into the cabin to start the day, and her eyes passed over the small shelf above the sleeping platform where Gideon had left 6 books, all practical, all annotated in his even handwriting. She counted them, 6, but the spacing was wrong. There was a gap on the right side of the shelf, a space the width of a book where dust had not settled, as though something had been there recently and was now somewhere else. She reached up and touched the empty space. Something had been removed or hidden. Before she could think more about it, Lenora called from outside, "Maren, come look, the figs! Come look at the figs!" Maren went. The morning light was just reaching the east wall, and the 3 silver streams were beginning to catch it, throwing small, bright flashes across the stone. Lenora stood in the garden with a ripe fig in each hand and a look on her face that Maren had not seen in months. Maren looked at her sister and at the trees and at the water falling steady and bright and impossible down the canyon wall, and she thought about the note their father had left with the deed. Go see it before you decide anything. They had seen it, and there was nothing left to decide. Their first week in the canyon, Maren and Lenora did not build or plant or repair. They learned. They walked the oasis end to end every morning and again every evening, studying the way the water moved through the stone channels at different times of day, noting which beds received the most light and which stayed in shadow until noon. Lenora began a journal on the second day using a blank ledger she had brought from Salt Lake City for bookkeeping practice, and she filled its pages not with numbers but with sketches. The shape of each irrigation channel, the angle of the light on the west wall at 4 in the afternoon, the particular way the fig leaves curled inward when the air temperature dropped after sunset. Maren's mind worked differently, she counted. 12 orange trees, each capable of producing roughly 300 fruits per season in this sheltered climate. And the climate was extraordinary because the canyon walls held warmth through the night, and the spring-fed water never stopped. 2 crops per year. That was over 7,000 oranges annually. The fig trees were already bearing. The herb beds, properly cultivated, could supply every household in Sandstone Crossing several times over and still have surplus for trade. She sat on the edge of a garden bed one evening with her father's letter spread on her knee and ran the numbers again. Then she folded the letter, put it back in her coat pocket, and looked at the orange trees in the fading light, and allowed herself for the first time to think the word future without immediately flinching away from it. On the fourth day, Lenore found the second fig tree. It was hidden behind a large flowering vine on the south wall, a mature tree with a thick trunk that had been growing there for years, and Maren realized that their father had planted it deliberately in concealment, protected from wind and from the view of anyone standing at the main clearing. He had designed this place with layers. Things revealed themselves only as you spent time here, only as you looked more carefully, and Maren understood with a slow, spreading recognition that this was how Gideon Kestrel had always communicated. Not in words, in the arrangement of things. Behind the second fig tree, pressed into a natural alcove in the rock, where the temperature stayed cool even at midday, Lenora discovered a carefully constructed storage cache for root vegetables, timber framing, ventilation gaps between the stones, a sloped floor so moisture would drain. Their father had thought of everything, and the evidence of his thinking was everywhere, quiet and patient and built to last. On the seventh day, Maren drove back to Sandstone Crossing to arrange the first sale of herbs. The proprietor of the general store, a thin, careful man named Silas, examined the bundles of rosemary, thyme, and sage that Maren laid on his counter. He turned them over in his hands. He held them to his nose. He set them down and looked at Maren with an expression she had seen before on men who were recalculating something. "These are uncommonly fresh for this time of year," he said. "Where exactly are you growing them?" "On our land," Maren said. Silas waited for more. Maren offered nothing. He agreed to take 24 bundles on consignment, and they sold out in 6 days. Mrs. Dunmore at the boarding house ordered twice the quantity for her kitchen. The word moved quietly the way information always moves in small towns, through side conversations and kitchen doorways, and the particular efficient network of women who run things without being credited for it. By the second week, Bertie Greer came to the canyon. Bertie was the wife of the church deacon, a strong-faced woman in her middle 40s, who ran the town's small, informal medical practice out of her back parlor. She knew plants. She knew what they could do, and when she walked through the herb beds with Lenora and bent to examine the lavender and the calendula and the wild healing sage that had seeded itself prolifically along the north wall, her face changed in a way that both sisters recognized. It was the same expression Josiah had worn in the livery, the look of someone revising everything they thought they knew. "Your father grew all of this," Bertie said. "He did," Lenora answered. Bertie straightened up and looked at Maren. "I serve families within 30 miles of Sandstone Crossing. Most of them have no access to fresh medicinal herbs from October through April. If you can supply me steadily, I can connect you with every household in that range." Maren nodded. "We can supply you." It was a small moment, a handshake, and a practical agreement, but Maren felt something shift beneath it, a foundation being laid, the first line of a structure that might, if they were careful, hold weight. By early November, the herb sales were steady enough that Maren had begun keeping a ledger of her own. She recorded income, expenses, seed costs, the price of the new seedlings she had bought on a trip to Cedar City, young pomegranate trees, and a grape cutting she carried all the way back wrapped in damp cloth. She recorded the names of customers and their orders and the dates they paid. And in the margin of the first page, in handwriting she did not realize was beginning to look like her father's, she wrote a single line, "We are building something." It was into this fragile, growing stability that the Braddock brothers rode on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November. Maren was hauling water from the basin to the far herb beds when she heard the horses. Lenora was on her knees in the garden with dirt on her hands and a sprig of rosemary caught in the fold of her apron. The sound of hooves on stone carried easily in the canyon's acoustics, and both sisters looked toward the entrance at the same time. Theron Braddock was the elder brother, and he was nothing like Leland. Where Leland was blunt and physical, Theron was composed. He was perhaps 40 with a civil, intelligent face and the particular brand of courtesy that powerful men adopt when they want something and see no reason to be unpleasant about it. He dismounted at the canyon entrance and removed his hat and waited for Maren to come to him because he understood, as his brother did not, that entering a person's property without invitation was a concession, and Theron Braddock did not make concessions. "Miss Kestrel," he said, "we heard Gideon's daughters had settled in. Thought we'd pay our respects." They had genuinely paid their respects. Theron spoke about Gideon with what seemed like real regard. He mentioned the quality of Gideon's survey work, the precision of his maps, the way he had been trusted by every landowner in the territory. It was not false. It was not even strategic exactly. It was simply the way Theron operated, building a foundation of goodwill before he built anything on top of it. Then he came to the point with the same civility. "We made your father an offer on this land 4 years back. We'd like to renew it at a better figure. You're two young women managing alone out here, and while we respect your position entirely, we simply want the water rights that come attached to the deed. We'd give you enough to set yourselves up well in Salt Lake City or wherever you intend to settle." He named a figure. It was more money than Maren had earned in 2 years of sewing. She kept her face neutral. She looked at Lenora. Lenora was perfectly still, garden gloves in her hands, and there was something in her sister's expression that Maren had not seen before. Not fear and not defiance, something closer to clarity. "We need to think on it," Maren said. Theron nodded pleasantly. "Of course, no urgency." He glanced past her toward the canyon interior. From where he stood, he could see nothing, just the shadowed gap between two red walls. He put his hat back on. "Your father was a private man, never did let us in to see the property. We always figured it was simply a matter of pride, not wanting to admit the land had come to nothing." He smiled, touched his hat brim, and rode away with Leland behind him. Maren stood in the entrance and watched them go and understood with complete clarity 2 things. First, they had no intention of accepting his offer. Second, and more importantly, Theron Braddock still did not know what was inside this canyon. Gideon had kept the secret perfectly, and Maren was going to keep it too. "They don't know," Lenora said from behind her, and her voice carried a new edge. "They think it's empty." "Yes, that's why Papa never let them in." Maren turned and looked at her sister and saw that Lenora was no longer the girl who had cried on the first day of the wagon ride. Something had happened in these weeks of digging and planting and learning the water. Something had taken root. "We don't let them in either," Maren said. "Not ever." She took the deed and the water rights documentation to Cedar City the following Thursday. She drove the 3 days alone, leaving Lenora at the canyon with Burl and the rifle and clear instructions. The lawyer Arden Bramwell read the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "Your father attaches the water rights to the land deed in perpetuity, properly filed, witnessed, registered with the Territory Office 8 years ago. The spring above the mesa is legally inseparable from this property." He paused, then allowed himself a small, precise smile. "Whoever advised your father on this knew exactly what they were doing. It's not an easy attachment to contest." "Can it be contested at all?" "Not successfully. Your father was thorough." Then Bramwell leaned forward. "However, Miss Kestrel, I should be clear with you. The paperwork is strong, but paperwork is only as strong as the system that enforces it. Out in the territories, law is only as reliable as the men who administer it. If someone has a friendly judge, strong papers can be delayed, challenged, reinterpreted. Not overturned necessarily, but made expensive, made slow, made painful. Maren heard what he was not saying. You're talking about Judge Nolan. Bramwell held her gaze. I'm talking about being prepared. She drove back with the papers folded inside her coat and a feeling she could not quite name. Relief and warning in equal measure. A door locked, but the knowledge that someone might try to break it. Josiah Ober came to the canyon in early December, hat in hand, and offered 3 days of masonry work on the north wall of the cabin. He explained, a capable mason when not occupied with horses, and the mortar needed attention before winter. He worked for 3 days and refused payment. On the last evening, he sat with them at the small table outside the cabin and drank the tea Lenora pressed on him and looked around at the canyon with the expression of a man seeing something he had given up believing existed. Gideon never said a word, Josiah said, finally shaking his head. Not one word. All those years riding in here by himself. That was our father, Maren said, and she found saying it that the words no longer carried the old complicated ache. They carry something cleaner. Recognition. Pride. Then Josiah set down his cup and spoke carefully. I need to tell you something else. Something I didn't say at the livery because your sister was there and I didn't want to frighten her. He looked toward the cabin where Lenora was washing dishes. 6 years ago, when Braddock took my land, the method was specific. First the offer, then when I refused, the water on my property started to change. The creek that fed my valley, it ran slower, then it nearly stopped. I rode upstream and found rocks had been placed across the channel on higher ground public land that wasn't mine or Braddock's, redirecting the water onto Braddock's property. Maren's hands went still on the table. I couldn't prove who did it. I suspected Leland, but there was no evidence. And by the time I brought it to the court, my land was dry, and Judge Nolan ruled I had no viable water claim. Josiah's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white around the cup. Your father was the one who mapped the original water flow. He proved the creek ran through my property naturally. Nolan threw it out, but Gideon kept his copies. He always kept his copies. Why are you telling me this now? Josiah looked at her directly. Because what happened to me is going to happen to you. The winter that followed was the gentlest the canyon would give them, though they did not know that yet. The walls held warmth. The spring never slowed. On the 3 mornings when frost whitened the desert floor above the oasis, stayed merely cool and still. The herbs slept lightly. The orange trees kept their leaves. Lenora taught herself to preserve using a handbook from their father's shelf. By midwinter, she had a row of sealed jars along the cabin wall. Orange marmalade, dried herbs in oil, fig preserves, a spiced apple butter she had invented through barter trading excess sage to a farm family north of town who had an apple surplus and no preserving knowledge. In February, a letter arrived from Theron Braddock, courteous, brief. The offer was substantially higher than the first. Maren wrote back in equally courteous, equally brief terms. She thanked him for his ongoing interest and informed him that the property was not for sale at any figure. She sealed the letter and gave it to the mail carrier and put a copy in the file she was building alongside the deed and the water rights and her father's 3-page letter. 14 days after she sent that refusal, the water in the canyon began to drop. It did not happen all at once. That was what made it so careful, so deliberate, so clearly the work of a patient mind. The third stream on the east wall, the smallest of the 3, slowed over 3 days and then stopped entirely. A trickle one morning, a drip the next, and then nothing, just a dark, wet stain on the stone where the water had been. Maren noticed on the 2nd day. By the 4th day, the second stream was weakening. She told Lenora nothing. She rose before dawn on the 5th day and left the canyon alone on foot and climbed. The mesa above was accessible by a steep rocky scramble on the north side, 2 hours of hard going over loose stone and brush. By the time she reached the top, her hands were scraped and her lungs burned, and the desert spread out below her in every direction, vast and red and utterly indifferent. She found the spring. She had never seen it before, had only known it existed from her father's letter, but she found it by following the moisture in the rock, the way Gideon had taught her when she was 16, reading the land, listening to what it was saying. The spring emerged from a crack in the mesa's cap rock and ran in a shallow channel across bare stone for perhaps 40 yards before it reached the point where the mesa's edge dropped away and the water fell into the canyon below. Except that now, halfway along that channel, someone had placed a line of heavy stones. Not a natural rockfall. The stones were too uniform, too deliberately positioned, and they redirected the water sideways away from the canyon's edge toward a shallow depression that drained east, toward Braddock land. The stones were recently placed. She could see the fresh scratches on their surfaces where they had been dragged into position. She could see boot prints in the thin soil around them. Large prints, a heavy man's prints, and she thought of Leland Braddock's broad frame and his good boots and the way he had looked at her in Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house. Maren stood on the mesa top and looked down at the canyon. From up here, the oasis was invisible. The narrow slot entrance hid everything. All she could see was rock and shadow, and she understood for the first time how fragile it all was. How a man with a pile of stones and a few hours of darkness could undo 8 years of her father's work. She climbed back down. It took longer going down than coming up, and by the time she reached the canyon floor, the afternoon light had turned the west wall gold, and Lenora was standing in the garden with her journal and a face Maren had never seen on her sister before. Not panic, something worse. Knowledge. Maren, the water is down by half from last week. If it keeps dropping like this for another 2 weeks, the orange trees won't survive. Maren looked at the orange trees their father had planted. The trees he had watered and pruned and tended for 8 years in secret, the trees that were heavy with their second bloom and carrying the weight of everything he had wanted to give them. Several leaves on the nearest tree had already begun to curl inward at the edges. "They won't die," Maren said. Her voice did not sound as steady as she needed it to. The next morning, she rode Burl into Sandstone Crossing and went directly to the saloon. It was 11 in the morning and the room was mostly empty, just 2 old men playing cards near the window, and Leland Braddock sitting alone at a table in the back with a whiskey glass and a ledger book doing accounts. Maren walked straight to his table and stood over him. He looked up slowly, without surprise, the way a man looks up when something he expected has finally arrived. "Someone blocked the spring on the mesa," Maren said. Her voice was level. "The water feeding our canyon has been diverted onto your land." Leland closed his ledger book. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her with an expression that was not hostile but was not friendly either. It was the expression of a man who is holding cards he knows are good. "Mesa's public land, Miss Kestrel. Anyone can move stones on public land. Could have been hunters clearing a path. Could have been runoff management. The territory doesn't regulate how water moves across open ground. The stones were placed to redirect the spring channel. That's not path clearing. You a surveyor now." A faint smile. "Lot of rocks up on that mesa. They shift around. Weather does things." Maren did not blink. "My father was a surveyor for 20 years. I know what deliberate placement looks like." The smile faded. Leland leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was lower. "Let me be real clear with you. You're a young woman standing alone in a saloon making accusations against the biggest ranch family in this valley. You have no proof. You have no witnesses. And the judge in this county has known my family for 30 years. He held her gaze. Think carefully about what you do next. Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I have thought carefully. She turned and walked out. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides and walked steadily to the livery, where she mounted Burl and rode back to the canyon without looking back. That night, after Lenore had gone to sleep, Maren sat at the table in the cabin and thought about the gap on the bookshelf. 6 books, space for 7. She had noticed it weeks ago and then forgotten it in the rush of settling in. Now in the quiet with the sound of the weakening streams coming through the window, it came back to her. She searched under the sleeping shelves, behind the hearthstones, in the storage cache behind the second fig tree. Nothing. She came back to the cabin and stood in the dim light and looked at the walls and thought about her father, Gideon Kestrel, who hid an entire oasis inside a canyon that looked like solid rock from the outside. Gideon Kestrel, who kept secrets the way other men kept money, carefully and with purpose. Her eyes found the hearth wall, specifically a stone near the left edge at shoulder height that was slightly different in color from the stones around it, slightly lighter, as if it had been removed and replaced more than once. She pried it out. Behind it was a hollow space in the wall, and inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound surveyor's notebook. Maren sat down at the table and opened it. Gideon Kestrel's handwriting filled every page. Not the brief, restrained language of his monthly letters, but the precise, technical notation of a man doing the most important work of his life. Diagrams of the mesa's geology, cross-sections of the rock layers showing how the spring water moved through natural fractures in the limestone cap rock down through sandstone and emerged on the canyon's east wall. Coordinates, measurements, angles of flow, and critically a detailed map showing the spring's origin point on federal public land, not Braddock land, with the water's natural path clearly traced from source to canyon. On the last page, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, as if written later, perhaps during the illness, Gideon had added a note. If someone tries to block the water from the mesa, remember this. The spring originates on federal land. No private citizen has the right to obstruct natural water flow on public ground. Take this notebook to a lawyer, it will hold. Maren closed the notebook. She pressed both hands flat on its cover and sat very still. Her father had known this day would come. He had watched what happened to Josiah Ober 6 years ago and understood that the same forces would eventually turn toward his own land. And so he had done what he always did. He had surveyed, he had measured, he had drawn the lines. And then he had hidden the evidence in a wall, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for the daughter he knew would be stubborn enough to look for it. She sat at the table for a long time after that, listening to the water grow thinner against the canyon wall, holding the notebook that might save everything. In the morning, she went to see Mrs. Dunmore. The boarding house was quiet mid-morning, the breakfast dishes cleared, and the afternoon guests not yet arrived. Mrs. Dunmore let Maren in and poured coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and Maren saw immediately that something had changed. Mrs. Dunmore's hands, usually steady and purposeful, moved with a slight hesitation. She did not meet Maren's eyes right away. Something has happened, Maren said. Mrs. Dunmore set down the coffee pot. Theron Braddock came to see me 3 days ago. He suggested in his way that it might be best for my business if I stopped buying herbs from you and your sister. Suggested. He mentioned that the ranch supplies my beef and pork. He mentioned that supply arrangements can change. Mrs. Dunmore's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, the sound of a woman who has spent years surviving alone and knows exactly how much that survival costs. I'm a widow, Miss Kestrel. I can't afford to lose my meat supplier. Maren nodded slowly. I understand. I don't think you do. Mrs. Dunmore looked at her, then fully and directly. I understand because I've been on the receiving end of Theron Braddock's suggestions before. Every woman in this town has. He doesn't threaten, he doesn't need to. He simply makes you aware of what you might lose, and then he waits. Maren stood up. Thank you for telling me. Miss Kestrel, Mrs. Dunmore's voice stopped her at the door. I said I can't afford to lose my supplier. I didn't say I've made my decision yet. Maren looked back at her. Something passed between them that did not need words. Then Maren walked out into the bright cold morning and stood in the street and felt the weight of everything pressing down and understood that she was now fighting on two fronts, the water above and the community below. She went back to the canyon. She packed the surveyor's notebook and the deed and the water rights documents into a leather satchel. She told Lenora everything, the block spring, the confrontation with Leland, Mrs. Dunmore's warning. Lenora listened without interrupting, and when Maren finished, Lenora said something that surprised them both. He prepared us for this, Maren. Papa didn't just build the garden, he built the case. Maren looked at her sister across the table where their father's letter had lain under a river stone and saw someone she was still learning to recognize. Not the girl who sang hymns when she was frightened. The woman who had been growing in this canyon alongside everything else their father had planted. I'm going to Cedar City, Maren said, to see Bramwell with the notebook. Lenora nodded. Then she stood up and went to the corner of the cabin and picked up the rifle and checked it with the same calm efficiency she brought to the garden. I'll be here when you get back. Maren left at dawn, 3 days to Cedar City, 3 days back, 6 days in which the water would keep dropping and the trees would keep dying, and Lenora would be alone in a canyon that someone had already tried to kill. She drove fast. Burl was old but willing, and the road was dry and firm, and Maren pushed harder than she should have because every mile behind her was a mile closer to an answer, and every mile ahead was another day the trees might not survive. On the third morning of the drive alone on the wagon seat in the early cold, she allowed herself to feel something she had been holding at arm's length for weeks. Not the fear which was constant now, and which she managed by refusing to look at it directly. Something else. The particular devastating weight of understanding that her father had spent the last decade of his life preparing for a battle he knew he would not be alive to fight. He had planted the trees. He had built the channels. He had secured the water rights. He had written the notebook. He had hidden it where his daughter would find it. And then he had died trusting that the lines he had drawn would hold. Maren arrived in Cedar City on a Thursday afternoon and went straight to Arden Bramwell's office and put the surveyor's notebook on his desk. Bramwell opened it. He read the first 3 pages. He turned to the map showing the spring's origin on federal land. He studied the geological cross-sections. He read the note on the last page. And then he closed the notebook and looked at Maren with an expression she had not seen on his careful, measured face before. Respect, undiluted and unconcealed. Your father built a fortress, Bramwell said quietly. Not out of stone, out of evidence. Can we use it? We can do more than use it. Bramwell pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began to write. The spring originates on federal public land. Obstructing its natural flow is a violation of territorial water statutes. But more importantly, if we file the complaint properly, it goes to the territorial court in Salt Lake City, not to the county bench, not to Judge Nolan. Maren felt something loosen in her chest. How long? The territorial filing takes weeks, but I can also file at the county level simultaneously. Force Nolan to respond publicly on the record, where his decisions can be reviewed by the higher court. Bramwell looked up. It's a risk. Nolan could issue a temporary order against you. Freeze your water usage while the dispute is pending. That would be within his authority. And the trees would die. Yes, Maren sat very still. Outside the window, Cedar City went about its ordinary business. Wagons and voices in the sound of a hammer somewhere. The world continuing as if nothing of consequence were happening in this small office. File both, she said. County and territory today. Bramwell nodded once. Your father would have said the same thing. Maren drove back toward Sandstone Crossing with the filing receipts in her coat and the notebook back in the satchel and a feeling in her body she did not have a name for yet. It was not courage exactly. It was something older than that. The knowledge that the ground beneath her feet had been prepared by someone who loved her, and that all she had to do now was stand on it. She was still 12 miles from Sandstone Crossing when she saw the rider coming toward her on the road. A single horse moving fast, raising a long plume of red dust in the afternoon light. As it drew closer, she recognized the rider. Lenora, on Burl's saddle horse, the spare they kept for short trips to town. Riding hard, riding alone, which meant she had left the canyon unguarded. Maren pulled the wagon to a stop. Lenora reined in beside her, breathing hard, dust on her face and in her hair, and in her hand she held a folded piece of paper. A man came from the county court this morning, Lenora said. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. He delivered this. Maren took the paper and unfolded it. It was a court order signed by Judge Nolan dated 2 days prior. It declared a temporary freeze on all water usage rights pertaining to the Kestrel Canyon property, effective immediately pending judicial review of a complaint filed by Braddock Ranch regarding disputed water access on the mesa above. Maren read it twice. The words were clear and precise, and they meant exactly what she feared they would mean. The water that was already dying in the canyon had just been made illegal for them to use. She folded the paper carefully. She put it in her coat beside the filing receipts from Bramwell's office. She looked at her sister, who was sitting on the horse in the middle of a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, with dust on her face and a court order in her wake, and the entire weight of their father's legacy balanced on what happened next. Maren, Lenora said, what do we do? Maren picked up the reins. She looked south toward the canyon, toward the orange trees that were dying, and the water that was being stolen, and the home that a quiet man had spent 8 years building in secret for the 2 people he loved most in the world. We fight, she said, the way he taught us, with the lines he drew. Maren did not sleep the night they returned to the canyon with the court order. She sat at the table with the document spread before her and the lamp turned low, and the sound of the weakening streams outside the window, and she thought not about the law or the Braddocks or Judge Nolan, but about time, how much of it they had, how little of it the trees could survive without full water. The orange trees were already showing stress along the lower branches, leaves curling tighter each day, and the second stream on the east wall had dropped to a thread so thin it barely darkened the stone beneath it. In the morning, she wrote 2 letters, one to Arden Bramwell in Cedar City, informing him of Nolan's order and asking him to expedite the territorial filing. The second to Josiah Ober, asking him to come to the canyon. Josiah arrived that afternoon. He stood in the garden and looked at the weakening streams and the curling leaves, and his face carried the particular stillness of a man watching something he has seen before. He did not need to be told what was happening. He had lived it. How long before the trees go, he asked. 10 days, Maren said. Maybe 12 if the first stream holds. Josiah looked at the east wall for a long time. Then he looked at Maren. I'll testify. At the county hearing when Nolan schedules it, I'll tell them what happened to my land. The same method, the same family, the same judge. They could come after you for that. They already took everything I had worth taking. Josiah's voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. Your father stood up for me when nobody else would. He lost, but he stood up. I owe him that, and I owe it to myself, and I've been waiting 6 years for the chance to pay it. Maren nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. Bertie Greer came the next day unasked. She had heard about the court order through the town's invisible network, and she came with a basket of food and a practical offer. She would testify as well. She would tell the court that the Kestrel herbs had become essential to her medical practice, that families across 30 miles depended on the remedies she prepared from what grew in this canyon, that shutting off the water would harm not just two women, but an entire community's access to medicine. "This isn't just your fight," Bertie said, standing in the herb garden with her hands on her hips and the canyon walls rising above her. "Theron Braddock has been deciding what this valley needs for 20 years. Maybe it's time someone else had a say." Lenora looked at Maren across the garden. The expression on her face was something new, something that went beyond the personal resolve Maren had watched growing in her sister over the past months. It was the recognition that they were no longer alone, that what their father had built was reaching beyond the canyon walls. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday, 3 weeks after Nolan's freeze order. 3 weeks in which the water continued to drop and the trees continued to suffer, and Maren and Lenora carried water by hand from the remaining stream to the roots of each orange tree, bucket by bucket, morning and evening, trying to keep alive what their father had spent 8 years growing. It was exhausting, relentless work. Maren's shoulders ached constantly. Her hands blistered and then calloused and then cracked in the dry cold. Lenora developed a system rotating between the trees in order of greatest need, checking the soil moisture with her fingers, the way she had learned from the garden itself, and she recorded everything in her journal with the same meticulous care she gave to every page, even as the entries grew more desperate. On the 12th day, the third stream stopped entirely. Only the first remained, and it was weaker than Maren had ever seen it. Lenora stood at the base of the east wall and pressed her hand against the stone where the third stream had run. The rock was still damp but cooling. She did not cry. She turned to Maren and said, "We need to talk about what happens if we lose the hearing." "We won't lose, but if we do," Maren looked at her sister. Lenora's face was sunburned and thin, and her hands were rough, and there was soil under her fingernails and in the lines of her palms, and she had never looked more like their father than she did at that moment, not in the features of her face, but in the steadiness of her gaze. "If we lose the hearing," Maren said slowly, "we appeal to the territorial court. Bramwell has already filed there. It will take longer, but the evidence is on our side." "And the trees?" Maren did not answer. They both knew the answer. If the territorial appeal took months, the trees would not survive. The garden would revert to stone and dust. Everything Gideon had built would be undone by the time the law caught up with the truth. Lenora nodded. She picked up her water bucket and walked back to the nearest orange tree and poured carefully around its base, not wasting a drop. The county courthouse in Sandstone Crossing was a single room attached to the back of the church with wooden benches and a raised platform for the judge, and 2 narrow windows that let in sharp rectangles of morning light. Judge Nolan arrived at 9 o'clock, a tall, gaunt man in his 60s with a carefully trimmed beard and the measured movements of someone who has held authority for so long that it has become indistinguishable from his posture. Maren sat in the front row with Arden Bramwell beside her. Lenora sat directly behind them. Josiah was 3 rows back in his best shirt, his hands folded in his lap. Bertie sat beside her husband, the deacon who had come not to testify but to be seen, which in a small town carried its own weight. The room was full. Maren had not expected that. She had expected the hearing to be a quiet procedural matter, a few people, a quick ruling, the machinery of local power doing what it always did. Instead, every bench was occupied. Mrs. Dunmore was there in the second row in her good dress. Silas from the general store, the farm family who traded apples for sage, 3 ranching families from the North Valley. a woman Maren did not recognize who turned out to be a school teacher from a settlement 12 miles east who used Birdie's herbal remedies for her students. They had all come. Nobody had organized them. Nobody had sent word. The network that small towns run on the conversations in kitchens and over fences and at church on Sunday mornings had done its work. Theron Braddock sat on the opposite side of the room with his own lawyer, a man from Cedar City named Everett, who had a reputation for thoroughness in a feat match. Leland sat behind his brother, arms crossed, jaw set. Theron's face was composed and civil the way it always was, but Maren noticed that his eyes moved across the crowded benches with something she had not seen in him before. He was counting, and the number he arrived at was not the one he expected. Judge Nolan called the hearing to order. Everett, the Braddock lawyer, spoke first. His argument was precise and well-constructed. The water rights attached to the Kestrel property were based on a surveyor's assessment, not an official territorial geological survey. The spring's origin point was contested. The mesa above the canyon was public land, and water flowing across public land was subject to general use provisions, not exclusive claim. The Braddock Ranch had legitimate interests in water access for its cattle operations, and the temporary freeze was a reasonable measure to protect those interests while the matter was properly adjudicated. It was a good argument. Maren listened to it and felt the ground shift slightly beneath her, not because the argument was right, but because it sounded right, and in a courtroom, sounding right was often enough. Then Bramwell stood up. He was not a dramatic man. He did not raise his voice or gesture broadly or appeal to emotion. He spoke the way he wrote, with precision and economy, and he laid out the facts the way a mason lays stone, one piece at a time, each one level, each one load-bearing. He presented the deed and the water rights attachment filed and registered 8 years prior. He presented the surveyor's notebook, and he walked Judge Nolan through its contents page by page. The geological cross-sections, the coordinates, the mapped water flow from source to canyon. And then he arrived at the critical point, the point Gideon Kestrel had understood 8 years ago and had recorded with the thoroughness of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting against. The spring originates on federal public land, Bramwell said, not on Braddock Ranch property, not on any private holding. The water flows by natural course from its source on federal ground into the canyon that Mr. Kestrel legally owned. Under territorial statute, no private citizen has the right to obstruct natural water flow on public land. The stones placed on the mesa were not natural. They were deliberately positioned to redirect the spring away from its natural course. This is not a water rights dispute. It is interference with a natural resource on federal ground. He paused and looked at Nolan. Furthermore, Your Honor, I have filed a concurrent complaint with the Territorial Court in Salt Lake City. That court has jurisdiction over federal land disputes and will be reviewing not only this case but the precedent established by similar water rights rulings in this county over the past decade. The room was very quiet. Maren watched Nolan's face. The mention of the Territorial Court had landed. She could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible stiffening of his shoulders. Nolan was not a stupid man. He understood exactly what Bramwell was saying. The Territorial Court would review his record, his rulings, his patterns, and patterns, once they were laid out clearly enough, told stories that even friendly judges could not rewrite. I would also like to call witnesses, Bramwell said. Josiah stood up. He walked to the front of the room and stood before the judge and spoke in a voice that was rough and low and carried the weight of 6 years of silence. He told his story, the valley north of town, the good water, the good grazing land, the offer from Braddock that he refused, the water that began to slow, The stones he found on the higher ground. The hearing before this same judge in this same room where his evidence was dismissed and his land was declared unviable, and the Braddock Ranch absorbed it within a month. I lost my home, Josiah said. I lost my livelihood. And I've spent 6 years watching from across the street while the man who took it rides past me every day. He looked at Nolan directly. Gideon Kestrel tried to help me. He brought maps. He brought evidence. You threw it out, Your Honor. I'm here today to ask you not to do that again. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room from the floor up. Maren could hear individual people breathing. She could hear the wind outside the single window. She could hear her own heart. Then Mrs. Dunmore stood up. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody expected it. She rose from the second row in her good dress with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, and she addressed the judge in the calm, practical voice of a woman who has survived alone for 15 years and has decided in this moment that survival is no longer the only thing that matters. Your Honor, I'd like you to speak. Theron Braddock came to my boarding house 3 weeks ago and suggested that I stop purchasing herbs from the Kestrel sisters. He reminded me that his ranch supplies my meat. He did not threaten me directly. He didn't need to. She reached into her pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. But he followed up with this letter confirming the conversation in writing. I believe he intended it as a record of a business discussion. I kept it as a record of something else. She walked forward and placed the letter on the judge's bench. Nolan looked at it but did not touch it. Theron Braddock, for the first time since Maren had known him, did not look civil. He looked at Mrs. Dunmore with an expression that had cracked open to reveal something raw underneath. Not anger exactly, but the shock of a man who has miscalculated badly and is only now realizing the size of the error. After Mrs. Dunmore, Bertie Greer stood. She spoke about the medicinal herbs, the families who depended on them, the children treated with lavender compresses and sage tea through the winter. Her husband, the deacon, stood beside her and nodded, and his presence said what his silence did not. The church was watching. Then Silas from the general store stood up and said that the Kestrel herbs were the best-selling item in his inventory, and that their loss would be felt by every customer he served. Then the apple farmer's wife stood up. Then the school teacher from 12 miles east. Then a man Maren had never met, a well-digger from the North Valley, who said simply that Gideon Kestrel had once surveyed his property for free when he couldn't afford to pay, and that he had come today because he believed in returning what was given. 7 people in a town of 40, nearly a fifth of the population, standing in a courtroom choosing a side. Judge Nolan sat very still through all of it. When the last person sat down, he looked at the letter Mrs. Dunmore had placed on his bench. He looked at the surveyor's notebook open before him. He looked at Theron Braddock. He looked at Maren. And then he ruled. The temporary freeze was lifted effective immediately. The water rights attached to the Kestrel property were affirmed as legally valid under the existing deed. The matter of obstruction on federal land was referred to the Territorial Office for investigation, with the court's recommendation that the stones on the mesa be removed within 7 days. Nolan delivered the ruling in a flat, measured voice, and he did not apologize or explain or acknowledge any of the testimony beyond its procedural relevance. He was not a man who admitted error, but he was a man who recognized when the ground had shifted beneath him, and his ruling was the sound of a man stepping carefully onto new footing. Theron Braddock left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Leland followed, his face dark, but Theron stopped him with a hand on his arm. At the door, a brief, firm grip that Maren could read even from across the room. Not now, not here. Outside in the hard, bright sunshine, Josiah stood beside Maren and Lenora on the courthouse steps and did not speak for a long time. Then he put his hat on and said, "Gideon would have liked today. Yes, Maren said, he would have. The stones on the mesa were removed within 3 days. Maren and Josiah climbed up together and moved them by hand, rolling the heavy rocks out of the channel and watching the water find its old path again, running clear and quick across the bare stone toward the canyon's edge. By the time they descended, the second stream on the east wall had already resumed. That evening, Maren sat on the mesa's edge for a few minutes before beginning the climb down. The valley spread out below her in deepening amber, and she could see the faint line of the road running north toward Sandstone Crossing, and beyond it the wide, empty country stretching toward mountains she could not name. She thought about the well digger who had stood up in the courtroom, a stranger, a man she had never met who owed them nothing but a memory of her father's generosity. She thought about how far a single act of decency could travel when given enough time. She thought about all the survey lines her father had drawn in his 20 years of work, each one a small decision about where things began and ended, and how many of those decisions had quietly shaped lives she would never know about. She climbed down carefully in the fading light, her hands steady on the familiar rock. The third stream returned the following morning. Lenora heard it first. She was in the cabin making tea at dawn when the sound changed, a new note in the canyon's constant water voice, higher and brighter, and she went outside and saw the third silver thread running down the stone in its ancient channel, and she stood there in the cold morning air and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed. The orange trees responded within a week. New growth appeared at the branch tips, pale green and tender against the dark older leaves. The curling stopped. The color returned. Maren walked the rows every morning and touched the trunks the way you touch something you almost lost, carefully with full attention, with gratitude that has not yet learned to take anything for granted. Lenora threw herself into the recovery with a focus that surprised even Maren. She spent 3 days rebuilding the soil around the trees that had suffered most, mixing in composted material she had been storing in the cache their father built. She added new drainage channels to the lower garden beds, using stones she selected from the canyon floor with the same deliberateness their father had shown. On the fourth morning, she came to Maren with a sketch in her journal, a plan for expanding the herb garden south along the base of the wall, where a narrow shelf of soil had been left untouched. She had calculated the sun angles for every month and mapped where each variety would grow best. Maren looked at the sketch and then looked at her sister. Lenora's face was intent and focused and alive in a way that bore no resemblance to the girl who had wept over a coffee cup in a lawyer's office in Cedar City. The canyon had done this. Or perhaps the canyon had simply given her the conditions to do it to herself. 1 week after the hearing, on a cool, still afternoon, Maren was working in the herb garden when she heard a single horse at the canyon entrance. She straightened up and wiped her hands and walked to the gap in the walls and found Braddock standing there alone, holding his hat in one hand and a rolled piece of paper in the other. He did not step inside. He waited for her the way he had waited the first time, respecting the boundary. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, and Maren could not read his expression. Then he held out the rolled paper. "I found this in my father's files last night," he said. "I was looking for something else, old boundary records, and I found this." Maren took it and unrolled it. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her father's precise, even script. The document was a boundary survey dated 12 years prior, commissioned by the elder Braddock Theron's father during a dispute with the federal government over grazing rights along the eastern edge of the ranch. The survey was detailed and meticulous, covering several miles of boundary, with coordinates and terrain notes and legal descriptions. And at a critical juncture where the ranch property met federal land, Gideon Kestrel's survey line had drawn the boundary in a way that preserved the ranch's access to a vital water source and 40% of its grazing land. A different surveyor, a less precise one or a less honest one, could have drawn that line differently. The federal government had contested the boundary, and Gideon's survey, precise, defensible, and unimpeachable, had settled the matter in the Braddock's favor. Maren looked up from the document. Theron was watching her. "My father paid your father the standard survey fee," Theron said. $60. Gideon never asked for more, never mentioned it again. He paused. "That survey saved this ranch. Without it, we'd have lost nearly half our land to the federal claim." The silence between them was different from any silence Maren had experienced with the Braddock before. It was not the silence of a man calculating his next move. It was the silence of a man standing in front of a debt he had not known he owed. "Your father drew the line that saved my family's land," Theron said, "and I tried to take the only piece of land he ever kept for himself." He did not say he was sorry. Theron Braddock was not built for apologies, and Maren did not need one. What she needed was what he said next. "You won't hear from us again. Not about this land, not about the water, not about anything. Whatever you and your sister are building in there, it's yours." He put his hat on. He mounted his horse. He rode away without looking back, and Maren stood in the entrance, holding a 12-year-old survey in her hands and feeling something she did not expect to feel. Not triumph, something more complicated and more complete. The recognition that her father's integrity, the same quiet, stubborn, uncompromising honesty that had made him a difficult man to know, had been working on their behalf long before they knew it needed to, in ways they would probably never fully trace. She rolled the survey up and carried it into the cabin and placed it in the file alongside the deed and the water rights and the 3-page letter and the surveyor's notebook. The record of a life measured in lines drawn true. Spring came to the canyon in a rush that Lenora documented in her journal, with the particular joy of someone who has been holding her breath for months and has finally been allowed to exhale. The pomegranate trees put out their first hopeful leaves. The grape cutting, which Maren had privately feared, was dead-rooted and sent 2 tender tendrils along the south wall feeling for the light. The herb beds thickened so rapidly that Lenora had to thin them twice in 3 weeks. The fig trees unfurled new growth, and the orange trees bloomed. They bloomed on a Tuesday morning in late March, and Maren and Lenora stood among them and breathed in the scent of the blossoms which filled the canyon from wall to wall, sweet and clean, and so strong it seemed to have a physical presence, as if you could lean against it. Mrs. Dunmore came to the canyon for the first time the following week. She brought 2 jars of her plum jam and a standing order for herbs that was 3 times larger than anything she had purchased before, and she walked through the oasis, slowly touching the stone channels and the tree trunks and the flowering moss along the cabin roof line. And when she came back to where Maren stood, her eyes were bright. "He built all of this," she said. "He did." Mrs. Dunmore shook her head slowly. "In all my years in this town, Gideon Kestrel walked through my door 100 times. Bought coffee, ate soup, never said a word about any of this." She looked at Maren. What a thing to carry alone. "He wasn't carrying it alone," Maren said. "He was carrying it for us." Mrs. Dunmore looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and brought out a small envelope, sealed, and placed it in Maren's hand. "Your father left this with me 4 years ago," she said. "He asked me to hold it in case anything ever happened to his girls while they were in Sandstone Crossing. He said I'd know when to give it to you." She paused. "I think this is when—" Maren opened the envelope after Mrs. Dunmore left. Inside was a single piece of paper, not a letter but a list, in Gideon's handwriting. 14 names. Family throughout the valley, each one followed by a brief note. "Surveyed property 1882, no charge. Marked well location, spring 1884. Settled boundary dispute with federal claim saved grazing rights. Located water source saved herd during drought of 1886. 14 families, 14 acts of quiet service stretching back across 2 decades. Not one of them had been mentioned in any of the monthly letters. Not one had been offered as evidence of a life well lived or a father worth missing. Gideon had simply done the work and moved on the way. Water moves through stone, wearing a channel through the years until the channel becomes permanent and the people who depend on it forget that it was ever not there. Maren folded the list and placed it in the file with everything else. Then she sat at the table for a while alone and let the weight of what she held settle into her properly. Not with sadness and not with the old familiar ache of missing someone who had never quite been present, with something else entirely. The slow, certain understanding that her father had been present all along, just not in the places she had thought to look. The weeks that followed were full of work and growth and the steady accumulating satisfaction of a life taking shape. Bertie expanded the herb distribution to 5 settlements within a day's ride. Silas at the general store gave the Kestrel products their own shelf, and by April it was the first place customers went when they walked in. The apple farmer's wife came to learn Lenora's preserving methods, and Lenora taught her with the same patience and precision she brought to her journal. And before long, there were 3 women making preserves from canyon fruit and trading them across the valley. Josiah came by every few weeks, sometimes to help with masonry, sometimes just to sit and drink tea and look at the trees. He never said much. But one evening in early April, as the light turned the west wall to copper and the first stream caught the sunset and threw it in bright fragments across the garden, he said something Maren kept. Your father used to say that the best survey line is the one that tells the truth about where something starts and where it ends. Josiah looked at the canyon walls. I think this place is where he started telling the truth about himself. Maren thought about that for a long time after Josiah left. She sat in the garden until the light was gone and the first stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky above the canyon walls. An owl called once from somewhere on the mesa, and the sound echoed down through the rock and settled over the oasis with the particular stillness that only enclosed places hold at night. She thought about a man who spent 20 years mapping other people's boundaries with perfect accuracy and perfect detachment, and who had found in a hidden canyon in the desert the one piece of ground where he could stop being detached, where he could plant things and build things and make something that was not a line on a map, but a life offered to the 2 people he loved most in the only language he knew how to speak. On a morning in late April, Maren rose before dawn. She dressed in the gray light and stepped out of the cabin and stood at the entrance of the canyon and looked back. The walls glowed in the first light, deep red shading to amber, where the sun touched the highest edges. The 3 silver streams ran bright and steady down the east wall, fully restored, throwing small moving flashes across the stone. The orange trees were heavy with their second bloom branches bowed under the weight of fruit and flowers together. The fig leaves were broad and green, the herb beds were lush and fragrant, and the grapevine had reached 4 feet along the south wall, climbing steadily toward the light. From inside the cabin came the sound of Lenora singing, an old hymn, the same one she had sung on the second morning of the drive south from Cedar City, except now the melody was unhurried and full and carried through the canyon's acoustics so that the stone walls seemed to hold it and give it back richer, layered the way a choir sounds in a church built for singing. Maren listened, then she went back inside. Lenora was at the hearth making coffee, singing softly, and she smiled at Maren without stopping. Maren sat down at the table, the same table where their father had left his letter under a river stone. She reached for the new notebook she had bought in Cedar City on her last trip, a plain leather-bound book, and she opened it to the first page. She picked up the pen. She sat for a moment looking at the blank page, and then she began to write. Not a letter, not a list, something else. She wrote the date, and below it she wrote in careful, even handwriting, "The first stream was running strong at dawn. The orange trees on the south side are bearing heavily and will need support poles within the week. The rosemary along the north wall has spread beyond its original bed and should be divided. The grapevine gained 6 inches this month. The second pomegranate is showing flower buds." She wrote the way her father had written in his surveyor's notebook. Precise, observational, recording what was there so that someone someday could read it and understand. Not just what grew in this canyon, but who had tended it and why and what it had cost and what it was worth. She did not write about the hearing or the Braddocks or the court order or the fear. Those things had happened and they were over and they had left their marks, but they were not what mattered most. What mattered most was here on this page in the quiet record of a living place set down by hand for whoever came next. Lenora stopped singing and came to look over Maren's shoulder. She read the first few lines and then she put her hand on Maren's shoulder and left it there. "You write like him," Lenora said. "I know." They stood together for a moment in the cabin their father had built in the canyon. Their father had found in the life their father had made possible with nothing but patience and stone and water, and the particular unshakable faith that the people he loved would find their way here and would know when they arrived that they were home. Maren closed the notebook. She put the pen down. She touched the smooth surface of the table where the river stone had sat, where the letter had waited, where everything had begun. Then she stood up and walked back through the narrow entrance, through the gap in the red walls, out to where the morning sun hit the desert floor, and the world opened up in every direction, vast and bright, and full of the kind of silence that is not empty but waiting. Behind her, the canyon held its breath the way it always had, patient, green, alive. And ahead of her, the road stretched south and north and east and west, the way roads do, offering nothing and everything, asking only that you choose a direction and walk. Maren Kestrel chose home. She turned around and went back inside.